Well, welcome everyone to Simon Fraser University's vibrant Vancouver campus. And before we begin, let me start by acknowledging the Coast Salish peoples on whose traditional territory we are privileged to gather this evening. It's a great privilege indeed to welcome you this evening to what is a special presentation entitled Culture, Community, Collaboration, New Directions for Protecting Indigenous Heritage with Professor George Nicholas. This lecture is being presented as part of SFU Public Square. And it's great to see some friends from the university here and some from across the water and others. So some of you may already know this, but for those of you who don't, SFU Public Square is a program that we initiated as a result of our new strategic vision to be Canada's most community-engaged research university, and to really see how we could, in every way possible, utilize our resources and our energies to not only educate our students, but to contribute to community betterment and development. And so this program, SFU Public Square, tries to do that through a number of different avenues and fora and dialogues. And this lecture tonight is a very special opportunity to share with you some of the research and initiatives of our leading faculty members. And I'm very, very pleased that we have the opportunity to welcome George Nicholas, who's going to come up here shortly and speak to us. He's the director of the Intellectual Property Issues in Cultural Heritage Project, which is more colloquially known as IPINCH. It's a collaboration of scholars, of students, of heritage, professionals, community members, policymakers, Indigenous organizations, of course, and not only locally, but from around the globe. And you know, we're a university that really tries to foster interdisciplinarity, internationalization, a respect for Indigenous peoples. And this project really does all those things. And of course, it is also about engagement of research with communities around the world. So it fits so well with what we as a university are trying to do. In fact, it points the way. It's very much something that I think is a signature and leadership initiative of the university. And we're very proud and pleased to be associated with it. IPINCH has about 52 scholars associated with it, 26 partnering universities and organizations, and its purpose is to explore the rights, values, and responsibilities of material culture, cultural knowledge, and the practice of heritage research. It was launched in 2008, and it serves both as a practical resource and a support network for communities and researchers engaged in cultural heritage work. Now, one of the reasons we decided, and George agreed to do this lecture tonight, is that IPINCH received a really prestigious and exciting award just a few months ago. The Social Science and Humanities Research Council announced the recipient of its first ever partnership award, and that winner was the IPINCH project and Professor George Nicholas. It's an award that recognizes a SSHRC-funded partnership that through cooperation and shared intellectual leadership has demonstrated impact and influence within and beyond the social sciences and humanities research community. So guess what? It's about engaged research. And to be the first recipient of this award as a university and for IPINCH is a great honor. And it seemed like just too good an opportunity to pass up to share with you what's been going on with IPINCH and with George. So let me tell you a little bit about George Nicholas. He's a professor of archaeology at SFU and has for over 20 years been working with Indigenous peoples in Canada, the United States, and around the world. His research focuses on intellectual property rights in archaeology, Indigenous archaeology, the archaeology and human ecology of wetlands, hunter-gatherers past and present, and archaeological theory. He's published widely in all of these areas and is the past editor of the Canadian Journal of Archaeology and currently co-edits the World Archaeological Congress's Research Handbooks in Archaeology series. He's also the former director of SFU's internationally known Indigenous Archaeology program in Kamloops. There will be a chance after he's talked to ask a few questions or pose a few comments, and a chance afterwards to gather over a cup of coffee and have some further discussion. So without further ado, please join with me in offering a very warm and appreciative welcome to George Nicholas. George.
Thank you. And let me start by acknowledging that we're on unceded First Nations land, and I am grateful for the privilege to be here. This is a great opportunity to speak about the process of doing archaeology is ostensibly to do a particular kind of research and finding ourselves drawn in a very different direction where we're actually trying to change how research is being done. And I'm going to talk about some of the reasons why this kind of research is so important from the ground up and kinds of issues involving intellectual property and cultural heritage that involve everyone, as well as some of the lessons that we've learned in this kind of engaged research. Before we do so, I need to back up a little bit and put things into context. I think my mother was very prescient in identifying where I might end up at age 6 months. And I had a very early interest in archaeology as a kid, reading archaeology books all the time. And my parents supported that interest to the degree that I took my archaeology field school before I actually started college, so in that first very formative year. And the archaeology that I was doing was very straightforward, very traditional archaeology. And my PhD dissertation was on early post-glacial land use, very oriented to how people engaged with their particular environments 10, 15,000 years ago. And that was the direction my career was going in until my wife, Catherine, accepted a job at what was then Caribou College, and along with our 2 sons, we ended up going to Kamloops. And before I knew it, I was involved in the newly developed program between SFU and the Secwepemc Cultural Education Institute, where I would end up spending the next 15 years developing an Indigenous archaeology program. And this was the most formative time of my life. And during those years of doing a different kind of archaeology, I learned some very important lessons, including these 3 questions that are essentially a mantra for what I do as an archaeologist and that I really try to think about every day. But these same questions pertain to any kind of research that anyone is doing. You know, why do we do archaeology? Can you explain that to the people whose heritage it is that you're working with? For whom do we do it? Do we do it for ourselves or for a larger community? And then what is the very best way that we can do that? So when we're talking about heritage, that's what we're talking about in archaeology, but what we're talking about with many other contexts. It's important to ask, well, what is heritage in the first place? And heritage is one of these fluid, multi-layered, multifaceted things or entities that has so much embedded in it, both material culture and the intangible aspects of culture. So it's knowledge, but it's also artifacts. It's places as well as people. So this is at the core of everyone's identity in some fashion or another, but especially so for Indigenous peoples. But one of the things that we can quickly recognize in the realm of heritage is not everyone has equal access to, not everyone has control over their own heritage. And let me explain what I mean by this with some very famous and maybe some relatively new examples for you. One of the issues here is who owns the past? And this is a loaded question because we can ask it in many different contexts in many different ways. But a case in point is this. This is one of the most famous sets of items in the British Museum, known to most people and known to the British Museum as the Elgin Marbles, named after the British aristocrat who collected them in the 18th century, having purchased the rights from the Turkish overseers. Or you might call them the Parthenon marbles. And depending upon which term you use, you are making a political statement as to whose patrimony that is, whose heritage that is. And the Greeks, for one, have been trying to get this back very strenuously for a long time. So here's one great example of who owns the past relative to cultural property. Here's another question that we can pose that's related. Who benefits from the past? And how is that past expressed? This is Harrods department store and the famous Egyptian room. And here you have one of the finest expressions of contemporary ancient Egyptian artifacts anywhere. And here we have a reconstruction of classic Egyptian architecture and so on, funded by Dodi Fayed, who is Egyptian. So this is his heritage that he is exemplifying here. But things get trickier when we go from material culture per se to the intangible aspects of culture, including what we call intellectual property, something that is familiar to all of you, especially those who have always legally downloaded music and videos and so on. But there's a copyright statement in front of every book basically saying who has rights to do whatever with this item. And this is an issue that has emerged in many different realms of research, from ethnobotany all the way to archaeology and beyond. And one of the most important things to recognize about this is that different cultures have different conceptions of heritage. And in the Western world, we tend to separate things in two categories. Material culture and intangible heritage are separate. But for many indigenous peoples, they're one and the same and there's no separation. And that has huge implications for how do we manage heritage. And when we're talking about intellectual property, we're basically talking about products of the mind. And these could be songs or recipes or formula or all sorts of interpretations of things that may take different forms in different contexts. And here, for example, we have two Ainu objects. The Ainu are the indigenous peoples of northern Japan, and they both share a design, both in material form, but that design is also a mental template in the heads of the creators or other community members who recognize that as a clan. So intangible heritage is one of the things that we really need to pay close attention to because it is really at the core of all aspects of heritage. Because a key point is that no artifact, no place, nothing, no material item has any value without the intangible qualities that we, whomever we are, endow it with. And one of the challenges that we have when we're talking about intellectual property or cultural heritage is making a distinction, which we sometimes have to do, between what is a cultural borrowing, which tends to be a neutral sharing of or use of someone else's heritage, and what is an appropriation, which is often something that is inappropriate or unwelcome, that is someone is using someone else's heritage in a way that may not be appropriate. So here's an example of what we can call a cultural borrowing. And this is, of course, the Parthenon, which becomes a key element of neoclassical architecture in Europe and beyond. And here we have a kind of sharing, a kind of borrowing of a kind of architecture that, in a sense, honors Greek or Roman heritage. So this is an example of a cultural borrowing as I've defined it. Here's an example of a cultural appropriation. All of you are probably familiar with the giant heads of Easter Island, the moai, but you can find a tissue box and buy one where you pull the tissues out of the nostrils, which is clever. It can be very amusing, but have you asked, how do Easter Islanders feel about this? What do these moai mean to them? And here's where we have to consider, is this an appropriation or not? So here's a series of examples that as I go through these, I want you to think, as I've defined them, what's an appropriation, what's a cultural borrowing? In fact, are those terms really covering everything? So here we have, from Newgrange, a Neolithic site in Ireland, these Celtic circles that are available in pendants, in tattoos, in many, many different products. Here we have Brian Youngin's very famous reconstruction of classic Northwest Coast masks, pictured over here on the left, reconstructed with Nike basketball shoes. And one question, some of you may know this, is Youngin is of First Nations ancestry, but not from the coast. He's from the northern interior. Kamloops Indian Reserve. Here you have images of petroglyphs and pictographs, that is rock art, that is gracing the marquee of a gas station on the reserve. This is in the Yucatan. You can partake in a quote-unquote authentic Maya sweat bath. Or I was with a family in Uxmal some years ago, and here is a white woman with a native drum with a bison painted on it, drumming and chanting until I heard the Maya guards tell her to go away because she was crazy. But here she is partaking in a place that is very important to you for whatever reason. Here's another example where it gets a little bit tricky as well. The Germans are mad about Native Americans. And at the Karl May Festival, you have these BMWs pull up, the executives get out, take off their three-piece suits, put on their buckskins, and they live like Indians for a week. And many Native American groups actually go over there to perform. Now, these examples are not limited to indigenous peoples. You can buy clothing and various items that celebrate the Dead Sea Scrolls. So we've got many, many different examples here. These are medicine wheels found in the southern plains that may be in animal or human form. And here you have a Lakota man praying at the turn of the century. And here in the fence around one of these, you have New Age offerings, where you have others coming to celebrate or partake in the energy. Of course, the Inukshuk, the symbol of the 2010 Winter Olympics. Some of you may have seen this cartoon at about that time. You have two Inuit hunters standing next to Inukshuk reading the message dropped from the mail plane saying it's from the 2010 Winter Olympics Organizing Committee. We have to take down our Inukshuks, they've trademarked it, which isn't really far from the truth as far as the Olympics go. You've got Mel Gibson appropriating everyone, including the Maya, with Apocalypto. And what about cases like this, where you have traditional or ancient foods that are being reintroduced or marketed, and who is the beneficiary of these? In some cases, it is the First Nations. In other cases, it's not. So, appropriation or cultural borrowing. And I think with these examples, you start to see that it's not an either or necessarily an easy answer. Now, in many of these cases, these are creative uses of culture, but there's also a great potential for these kinds of uses or appropriations to cause harm. Sports teams, of course, are widely recognized as impinging upon the identity or at least causing harm or concern to many Native American groups. You have ancient rock images from the Southwest with Kokopelli, for example, that you could buy in many different forms of jewelry and so on, or rock art from the Southwest as well. You could buy it as a t-shirt. Now, in many cases, people turn to the past as an expression of identity, but also of appreciation. And many archaeologists that I know wear archaeology images on their t-shirts and so on. So sometimes people turn to the past as a means to celebrate or respect it. But sometimes they go a little bit too far. Again, the 2010 Winter Olympics and the Russian ice skating team wore costumes based on Aboriginal Australian rock art and body painting. And of course, they did their research, like some of my students do. We researched a lot of information on the internet. The response to many Aboriginal Australians was a little bit different, who found their dance routine and costumes highly offensive. And speaking of the Winter Olympics, all of you are familiar with Inukshuk. You can go into any gift shop in Canada and find 1 million different varieties of Inukshuk products. And there's a real danger here, as I'll get to in a moment. And on one hand, it can be seen as a celebration of Inuit culture, but there's a little bit more to it than that. So with these examples, there's 3 basic types of harm that we may see. The first is economic harms, where someone is replicating or marketing items from someone else's heritage who's not of that heritage. And several years ago, the Egyptian legislation began to develop some policies by which to curtail the unofficial use of Egyptian artifact replicas and photographs. But this is, as I mentioned in another context today, it's like locking the barn doors after the horses have left. There's spiritual harm. In many cases, for many indigenous peoples, rock art images of ancestral beings or supernatural beings are not simply pictures of them, they embody those beings in the image. And so for many indigenous peoples, having t-shirts with those images is very, very dangerous, if not offensive. And on the other hand, there's not always harm with these uses of someone else's heritage. We see this in Ireland with the Newgrange site. It's a celebration. We see it in many, many other contexts. But where there is harm, it often falls along these lines, where there's a diminished respect for the sacred. There is improper use of an image. There's the benefits of producing that item are now somewhere else, in China, for example. So these are some very real harms that may take form. And there's also a host of new challenges that are emerging. And these are challenges that are not only affecting researchers working with indigenous communities, but naturally the universities that are involved. It involves the public as consumers. It involves the knowledge holders, the descendant communities, whomever they are, indigenous or otherwise. And here are some examples of some of these new challenges as they are emerging. One is DNA. There is more and more research being done on modern and ancient DNA. And there's a host of issues wrapped up in this. And on this image that I put together a few years ago, relating to the DNA strands, you've got commercialization, you've got issues of blood quanta, that is identifying who you are by how much blood of a certain group you have in you, genetic databases, repatriation, scientific colonialism, patent law, and on and on and on. And some of these uses are beneficial to the individuals, and some of it may be something they need to be wary of. You have more and more instances of traditional images being used in commercial products. And there's a big difference between the Cup wineries, which has rock art. This is a native-run winery using rock art from their territory, and Yellowtail, which is from Australia, using a stylized version of so-called X-ray rock art from Australia. Cultural tourism is really taking off, and there's lots of opportunities, but also issues involved with this in terms of who is running the program. Is it the community that's making decisions about how they present themselves, or is it some sort of outside outfit? There's more online and digital and virtual displays of culture and museum materials, including the Reciprocal Research Network at the University of British Columbia, which is exemplary for doing leading edge work in this area. There's also lots of efforts to basically open up knowledge to everyone. And this is something that Creative Commons, Fair Access Movement, and many others are trying to promote. And getting back to archaeology briefly, one concern that emerges is more and more archaeology is being done in advance of construction projects and highways rather than traditional research projects. And what's going on here is that archaeologists, in many cases, need to get permission from the companies or even the clients to talk about the research results that they have. So there's a kind of curtailing, in many cases, of knowledge about the past. And one of the most exciting and big unknowns in terms of where heritage research is going is in 3D printing and scanning, where you could take an object, scan it, and produce through a 3D printer, exact replicas. And who owns those replicas? Who has access to the originals? And a host of complicated projects quickly emerge here. So I've laid out some of the challenges. I've laid out some of the problems relating to appropriation, commodification, and cultural borrowing, and a host of other things like that. And many indigenous peoples and other descendant communities have raised concerns about such things because they have had little access to controlling their own heritage or benefiting from their heritage as a result of scholars or scientists coming in to their territory, working on their heritage, and then taking that information out of the community and benefiting, that is, the research is benefiting and very little comes back to the community. So how can we move forward in a way that is both proactive, that heads off problems that have emerged in other contexts? How can we work together to fully identify the kinds of issues and the best path forward? Well, this is where I want to transition from talking about things in a descriptive way, talking about things in a theoretical way, and start to use our understanding of things to do things. And this is with the Intellectual Property Issues and Cultural Heritage Project that Andrew had alluded to earlier. And the iPinch project is a massive undertaking, and if I knew back then what I've learned since, I wouldn't be up here today. But it has been an absolutely challenging, absolutely wonderful, and very, very, very hard project to work with for a number of reasons. These are our 4 primary objectives. And the first of these is basically along the lines I've already mentioned, to figure out what's going on in the world in many, many different contexts as to intellectual property, intangible heritage, and what are the issues, what are the opportunities, and how are people dealing with some of these issues through policies or through lawsuits in some cases. Secondly, and this is from a more academic standpoint, to analyze what we see unfold. And of course, in true academic fashion, to theorize about this and try to understand how and why the world is the way it is relative to these issues. But to do that as a stepping stone to generating and identifying good practices and a deeper understanding of what the issues are, because that then shines light on how can we solve problems. And then finally, to take everything that we've been learning with our partners, with the communities, with the scholars, and to mobilize that knowledge, to get it out there to people who need it. And again, this project is not about shutting things down, it's not about censorship, it's about making things better for everyone. It's a big project, as I mentioned. We have more than 50 scholars, 26 partnering organizations, another 50 plus associates and graduate fellows from all over the world. And our community partners range from the World Intellectual Property Organization in Geneva, to Parks Canada, to the Stolo First Nation here in the Lower Mainland, and many, many others in many parts of the world. Our project is looking at a number of major themes. And here we can talk about bioarchaeology and genetics. We can talk about cultural tourism. We could talk about ethics. We could talk about open access. All of these larger realms of research and engagement that sort of unfold the issues I've been talking about already. Another major component of the project is our knowledge base. And this is a publicly accessible research tool where you can, members of the public, type in the keywords or the areas, and you will find many different bibliographic resources that you can then track down. But the primary thing I want to talk about regarding iPinch is our community-based research projects. And a statement by my colleague Sheila Greer really encapsulates this so well. What happens to research when the community is in the driver's seat? And this is, for researchers, traditional researchers, a very dangerous proposition. And yet, as I hope to demonstrate, this is one of the most exciting and the most productive realms of research today. This is also one of my favorite photographs of all time, Geronimo in his Cadillac. So we have 15 community-based initiatives around the world, and you get a sense of the spread from here. We also have researchers working in or on research topics relating to many other parts of the world. But I want to give you a very quick overview of what some of these projects look like. And if you're interested, you could find out much more on our website. But the first of these is working with the Inuvialuit communities from up north. And about 150 years ago, traders collected and bought from the community about 150 or more artifacts and objects, which ended up in the Smithsonian Institution. And the community has been wanting to re-engage with that collection to look at such things as clothing style and how things were made. And so we've got a kind of repatriation here, not of the objects, but of the information embedded in those objects. We're working with the Saginaw Chippewa tribe of Michigan regarding a petroglyph panel, and petroglyphs are carvings in rock. And one of the images in this panel is of an archer. And here's an interesting thing to consider, because we talk about copyright and protection and what's appropriate or not to use. Several tribal members wanted to use this image as a logo for a sporting goods store. And the tribal elders said that's not appropriate because this man is not hunting, he's shooting knowledge into the future. So here we have this kind of self-control within the community as to what is appropriate or not. This panel with many different carvings, but as the Saginaw Chippewa would say, many different teachings, is currently controlled by the state of Michigan, and there's an enclosure over to protect it. But these carvings are still used today for ceremonial purposes. And here you have the women washing it off because birds roost under the roof and deface the images, and the rain is not there to wash it off. But here's one of the great ironies in terms of what this project is all about, trying to regain control and management of this, which is in a state park. There is a very tall chain link fence around this. And when I was out there some years ago, here I was with tribal members waiting for the park employee to come with the key because the tribe does not have a key to it. We're working with others in the north in Nunavik. The communities there want to engage in cultural tourism, but they don't want to do so at the expense of the impact or negative impact on their cultural heritage and values. So we're working with them to try to come up with workable strategies. We're working with colleagues in Kyrgyzstan. And let me tell you, there's nothing more challenging than trying to fund a project in a place where they were at that time having revolutions. This is another case where the community wants to share their cultural heritage with outsiders through education programs and cultural tourism. And they have developed a set of various initiatives to do that, including new programs in the school about the Kyrgyz ancient cultural heritage. Working with the Penobscot tribe of Maine. And here this is developing not only a tribal-based intellectual property office to better serve the needs of the community, but to develop workshops for outside researchers to become educated in the basic Penobscot values before those researchers work within the Penobscot homeland. In the Yukon, working with Yukon First Nations to develop government-to-government policies between Yukon First Nations and the provincial and federal governments so that the community's values and community's perceptions of heritage are effectively embedded in all heritage legislation. Working with the Moriori of New Zealand, and here we have an effort to gather up elders' knowledge of the cultural landscape to help the Moriori make informed decisions as to developing or using that land. And what's important about this project is that it's engaging the youth as knowledge collectors and getting them involved with their elders. On projects like this, in a sacred grove, for example, there are these trees with what archaeologists call arbor grafts, and what the Moriori call, these are our ancestors, and our ancestors are here right now. And again, this is not images of ancestors, these are the ancestors themselves. Some of these trees are damaged by disease, so the Moriori are also capturing through laser scanning these images and actually removing too these arbor grafts or ancestral images and protecting them. Working with the Manum River Aboriginal community in southern Australia. And this project is focused on one of the most well-known archaeological sites in that area. And the scientific story is what's always been told, but here you have the Manum River people telling their side of the story about the dreamings of the ancestral beings and what those beings did here. They are telling about their local values and their customs through signage, through booklets, and they're also hoping to start eradicating and replacing a lot of the incorrect information that's on websites. Closer to home, we're working with the Stolo First Nations. One of the most challenging issues that Indigenous peoples have, as well as archaeologists, is how do they deal with ancestral human remains? And to do so in a way that's respectful. And so the Stolo are working to develop policies that help to enable outside researchers to work in a culturally appropriate way with those ancestors before those ancestors are eventually returned and reburied. And this, I think, and we all think, is going to be a model that other First Nations can adopt to allow scientific research to be done, which many First Nations want to do, including ancient DNA work, but to do so in a way that's not harmful, that's appropriate. Also working up in Secwepemc territory. And this is a project that's turning the equation around, that starts with the assumption that if the Secwepemc have full control over their heritage and lands, what do those heritage policies, what do those political relationships look like? This is, as some would say, a very radical approach. We're not working with a known community per se, that is a particular tribal community. We're working with individuals from many different First Nations. And they are a different kind of community. We're working with the Hopi tribe of the Southwest. And this is a very important project that is capturing the long history of Hopi's engagement with outsiders and with developing very effective heritage policies that protect Hopi cultural values and patrimony, and also then decide what is it that can be shared. The Inuit Heritage Trust, they have asked us for assistance in exploring different ways to develop and strengthen heritage policies up north. And then two last projects to quickly mention, working with the Ainu of northern Japan. These are the indigenous peoples there that were only officially recognized by the Japanese government as the indigenous peoples in 2008. And they have asked us for help. They're basically at the ground level of developing their policies. So we have been working with them, and then also with the San of the Botswana and Namibia. How does this research differ? The first thing about it is that the community is in charge. They identify what the issues are that they want outsider help with. That is our research team. They vet or approve the research process. They review and approve all of the research results through surveys, for example, before those results are released to the research team to ensure that no sensitive or culturally inappropriate information leaves the community. And they could pull out of this at any time. And what you have here is a very different kind of research, but one that is very effective and very satisfying. And in the course of developing these projects, and that's a whole other story in terms of how do we get these funded through the university system or university to university system and so on. In the process of all of this, we've learned a number of really valuable lessons that we can share. And the first of these is that heritage is not just one thing. And heritage is defined in many different ways by many different people. And if you're dealing with a particular community, the first thing you've got to do is start talking to them and asking them questions and asking, what is important to you? How do you value your heritage? But more importantly, what is it that constitutes your heritage? And a case in point are these ancestral trees with the Moriori. This is a living being for that young Moriori girl. That is her ancestor there and now. And this has huge implications for how do we develop successful heritage management policies. A second lesson is that repatriation is not limited to material culture. It includes the information. It includes images. It includes knowledge that can be brought back to the community. Third lesson is that there's a need, there's no cookbook approach to any of this, that it's always going to be contextual. It's always going to be based on the kinds of issues that have shaped that community that they're continuing to confront. And we need heritage models that reflect this, that appreciate that. And here's, working with Secwepemc peoples, this is Sarah Denault on the left. She's a Secwepemc elder. I knew her when I was in Kamloops some years ago. And one of the issues that came out in this workshop I was at was the potential impact of mining on the traditional Secwepemc way of life. And Sarah comes to the workshop. The first day she's whispering a few comments here and there. Second day when we were talking about mining, she got up and for about 20 or 30 minutes, she went from a whisper to shouting about how important the land was to her well-being, to her identity, the traditional foods that shaped her. And it was a remarkable example of how deeply ingrained the individuals are in the land and why they are so concerned about the loss of that land, which carries with it a loss of much else. We have to move from consultation to collaboration with effective heritage management. Consultation is a good thing, but too often it's shallow. Collaboration is different because here we're talking about full and equal decision-making or power sharing. And this really gets to the core of the matter in the same way that reconciliation is not just saying you're sorry. Reconciliation has to be about fundamentally changing how things are done. There are other challenges too. And there are cross-cultural differences that make research very difficult. We've been working with the Ainu, as I mentioned, and there is a big language gap there, not just in the speech, but you can't even read the ideographs, the kanji. And we've had 3 visits there from IPINCH team members, including myself, and also several delegations of Ainu coming here. It wasn't until our 3rd meeting last November that they finally came through and told us what they really, really want us to do. And here's the kind of issues that we're dealing with. That, it's a language issue, but there's cultural issues too, in the sense that when someone says yes, it doesn't necessarily mean yes, they really agree with you. It's yes, they're acknowledging what you're saying. And so over the 3+ years of working with the Ainu, they were checking us out, trying to figure out what we were up to and where we could really help them. And finally, they came through once it was clear that we were really making many efforts to engage fully with them. So, and the last lesson is this. We could theorize about things until the cows come home, but it's not until we take that knowledge and do something with it that knowledge really has the big payoff. And it's not just these community projects. There's many other kinds of initiatives that we've been working out through IPINCH, including traditional licensing projects, where communities, in the same way of Creative Commons, can identify what is appropriate use of some aspect of their heritage or their knowledge or images of their cultural heritage. We're also engaged with many researchers and associates, including filmmaker Ellen Frankenstein, who is working with an acclaimed weaver, Haida weaver, who is replicating a hat that was worn by Kwede Dan Sinchi, long ago person found, that individual found in a melting glacier in northern British Columbia some years ago. So these are all important points of engagement because we're getting information out to the people who need that information, communities, but also consumers. And one of the most important aspects, too, of our project that I haven't mentioned yet is not only capacity building within the communities, but capacity building in the university and helping to train and provide opportunities for the next generation of scholars who's going to go out there and move forward in I think, a more ethically informed and community engaged way. We've got lots of information available on our website that we encourage you to check out, including our newsletter. And if you go to our website, you can take the appropriation of the month midterm exam. Every month we pose an appropriation of the month, appropriation with a question mark after it. And you can log on to our web, or just go to our website, and here's the instructions, and then there's a series of 10 images with questions, including this one, traditional Inuit snow goggles, which you can now buy. I hate to say replicas of, because they're not quite replicas, but they are certainly modeled on. And you can respond. Is this a misappropriation, cultural borrowing, or something else? I was with a couple of Inuit colleagues from the Inuit Heritage Trust a year or so ago, and I showed them a picture of this. They had never seen it, and they were astounded. I mean, it never crossed their mind that anyone could or would do something like that. So, I encourage you to take this, and you don't need to actually respond with any answers in the comment box, but you're welcome to, and you will read some comments down there, as well as some clues or not that I have posted. And at the end of it, there's a quote-unquote extra credit question with the 1491s. And if you want the Indigenous take on appropriation and marketing of commercial Indigenous products, check out this video link to their Indian store. We have lots of videos of team members speaking at different events with the iPinch project, students and our associates and team members and so on. If you read kanji, you can go to our Wiki Japan page. But seriously, this is the kind of thing that we did that makes our Ainu colleagues recognize that we are being really serious about getting information to them in a way that is useful to them. And we are trying to engage with other parts of the world. If you read Cyrillic, you can read one of my articles that I, of course, did not write, I have to admit. And then let me just conclude with these comments. So I've scoped out this project. This has been the ride of a lifetime as director, but I've had the opportunity to work with some of the most socially committed people in the world, and I'm just so grateful for Kelly Bannister, one of the co-directors, John Welch, who's on the research team, Eldon Yellowhorn on the research team, and many others. Getting our funding from the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada was a challenge. It took us 4 different tries. That was our last letter of intent, 696 pages. And that's just to get accepted to turn in the final full application. The SHRC committee really liked our project. The first time we were very naive and we didn't do a good job with the application, but they said, we like what you want to do, reapply. We were finalists the next 3 times, but each time the committee, as we figured out, didn't like what we were doing because they didn't like our methods of saying we're turning over control of the research to the communities. In our last time there, and each time you're finalists, you actually go to Ottawa with several team members and you meet with the committee. And we argued, I think, very successfully that this is the only way that we could do this kind of research, and we were successful. We got our $2.5 million for this project. But here's where I'm talking about the gauge of how and what we've done. Just after iPinch got funded, I was giving a talk in Dublin, Ireland, at a conference sponsored by Archaeology Ireland. And I basically gave a very early version of this presentation with examples of appropriations and commodifications and talked about potential harms and so on, and then sketched out what iPinch was planning to do. At the end of the talk, the question period, and a very distinguished gentleman stood up with a coat on and a bow tie, of all things. And he said, This is the most dangerous presentation I've ever heard in my career. I hope your project fails miserably. And I was astounded. And I spent a few minutes trying to explain how he had totally misunderstood that this isn't about censorship, it's not about curtailing the research process, it's about facilitating research and so on. But he never got it. So that is one point of measure for where we are. The second is, as Andrew had so nicely said, we received the 2013 Partnership Award from SSHRC. And the reason I have this here is that this is so ironic that after struggling for so long to get them to accept the kind of research that we needed to do, of turning stuff over to the community, 5.5 years later, they give us an award for doing exactly what we said we were going to do. And what's important here is not that we won this. What's important is that the research process in Canada is starting to change. It's starting to accommodate this kind of research that's difficult, that's challenging, but it really points to where research has to go if you're doing anything with communities. But the last point of measure is this. And this is Sydney Martin, an Anishinaabe elder from Michigan in the center. And at a meeting several years ago, she said this, and I still get the chills every time I read this or hear her on tape. I told them that they've given birth not only to ideas, but to breaking ground for the world to know how to work with each other and learn to trust with each other. And in giving birth to that wonderful feeling of collaboration and respect, iPinch now has its own spirit, and that means it's alive. This is the most gratifying statement I've ever had for anything that I've been working with, and this really captures what we've been trying to do. So this gives you a sense of what the iPinch is all about. iPinch project is all about, as a way to facilitate community-based and community-oriented research that is based on collaboration. And it's again, just been such a wonderful time. And I need to thank everyone, my family, my colleagues for helping to make this possible. Thank you.
And I really want to thank George for an incredible presentation, but I want to take the liberty to say something about why I think this project and the work that people around iPinch are doing is so significant. And it relates, I think, to what George was saying about the difficulty of getting that SSHRC grant, about the comment that was made to you. The whole idea of mutuality, of collaboration, or of engagement, this idea of the engaged university, the way in which this project has been carried out, and the notion that this is a co-equal relationship between a university or universities and communities is a very radical notion in terms of universities. If you think of it, the caricature of universities has been the ivory tower. And the physical manifestation of that, of course, has been a university apart from the community, in a tower above the community. And to the extent that universities, like Simon Fraser, are now coming down from that tower and being part of the community, that's the physical representation of a change of relationship. But for disciplines, the privilege of being an academic and having academic disciplinary knowledge has always been that you have some corner on the truth. You have some privilege, and that's what gives you your status. To admit as an academic or as someone with disciplinary knowledge that maybe there are others whose truths are as valid and important as yours, and to share with them your knowledge in a climate of mutual respect in which their knowledge is as important as informing, is a very radical idea. It requires one as an academic and as a university to acknowledge that maybe one isn't quite as special and quite apart and is quite as high in that tower as we used to think we were. And yet the benefits of doing that are huge. First of all, because it isn't true that universities and disciplines have corners on the truth. There are many other corners that challenge those truths or add to them. And secondly, because there is so much greater satisfaction that I see in George and in other projects at Simon Fraser where there is a mutuality and in which the traditional knowledge or understanding is informing the academic knowledge is changing the discipline. But I think the reason that Shirk was so resistant is because this is a very dangerous idea from an academic traditional perspective, from an ivory tower perspective. I suspect the fellow in Ireland perhaps wasn't as concerned as you thought he was about the implications of the project in instrumental terms, but what it meant to the privilege that he and other academics, if he was an academic, enjoyed. And the thought that that privilege would have to be put aside or leavened significantly in order to participate in a wholly new and different way. And it's through leadership such as that of George and those at iPinch in showing there's a different way and a more responsible way and a more respectful way for universities to engage with communities that I really want to say we owe you and your team a huge debt of gratitude. And it's one of the reasons why I do see you as a huge leader and exemplar for our vision of SFU as an engaged university. And on behalf of all, I want to thank you for an incredible lecture tonight and for demonstrating that, in fact, you are walking the walk of engagement, collaboration, and mutuality. Thank you so
very
much.
much.